You check a map before a trip. You type in a destination. You watch a blue line appear on a screen, and you trust it completely without ever wondering how anyone figured out the route in the first place. Your ancestors had none of that. No maps, no roads, no satellites, no idea what waited over the next ridge, across the next river, or on the other side of an ocean they could not see the end of. And yet they went anyway. They crossed deserts on foot. They crossed mountain passes in winter. They crossed open water in boats that, by modern standards, should not have survived the trip at all. So how did they actually do it? How did people with no instruments, no writing, and no prior knowledge of the planet manage to spread into nearly every corner of it, from frozen tundra to tropical islands to deserts that can kill an unprepared traveler in a single day? The real answer is far stranger than they just walked. Start with the walking part, because even that hides something surprising. Modern humans began leaving Africa in major waves roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. That sounds like a single event, a clean line on a timeline. It was not. Genetic research comparing populations across Asia, Europe, and the Pacific has shown that these migrations happened in pulses. Movement stalled for thousands of years in some regions. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, it surged forward across enormous distances within a handful of generations. Why would movement suddenly speed up like that? Climate. Ancient humans were not explorers in the romantic sense you might imagine. They were opportunists, reading the environment and reacting to it. When ice ages locked up huge volumes of ocean water as glaciers, sea levels dropped by well over 100 meters in places. Land that is underwater today sat exposed as dry plains and coastal shelves. A trip that looks impossible on a modern map was, at certain points in history, simply a walk along an exposed coastal plain that no longer exists. That is how people crossed from Siberia into North America. Not through heroic exploration into the unknown, by walking across land that is now submerged beneath the Bering Strait, following herds of large grazing animals that were making the exact same journey for the exact same reason: survival, and nothing more romantic than that. But land bridges do not explain everything. They do not explain Australia. Here is the detail that quietly breaks the "they just walked everywhere" theory apart. Modern humans reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago. Archaeological work at ancient rock shelter sites in the country's north has pushed that date earlier than most researchers expected only a decade ago. The problem is geography, and it is a serious one. Even at the lowest sea levels of the last ice age, Australia was never connected to the Asian mainland by dry land. There was always a stretch of open ocean in the way. To get there, someone had to cross open water. Repeatedly. Successfully. With enough people surviving the trip to found a lasting population that didn't simply die out within a generation. Think about what that actually requires. Not a raft pushed out to sea on a whim, drifting wherever the current happened to carry it. A vessel capable of carrying multiple people, plus food, plus fresh water, across a strait wide enough that the old coastline would disappear behind them long before any new land appeared ahead. And they had to attempt this without knowing, in advance, that anything was even out there waiting for them. Why would anyone take a risk like that? Researchers studying early maritime behavior have proposed that it likely wasn't a single bold decision made by one desperate group. It was probably a slow accumulation of short water crossings between islands that were still visible from shore, each one building the skill, the boat design, and the confidence needed for the next slightly longer crossing, until the final unavoidable open water stretch was simply the last step in a habit, not a leap into the void. That reframes the entire idea of ancient travel. It wasn't about courage in the way we picture it now. It was about practice, repeated so many times that a genuinely dangerous act started to feel routine. Now, take that idea and push it thousands of years forward into the Pacific Ocean. Long before compasses, before written charts, before any instrument that could tell direction with a needle or a screen, human beings sailed across the largest ocean on the planet and found tiny islands separated by thousands of miles of open water. Not once, repeatedly. reliably enough to settle nearly every habitable island stretching from the western Pacific all the way to Hawaii and Easter Island, an area covering roughly a third of the Earth's surface. How does a person find an island they have never seen, using nothing but their own senses? They learn to read the ocean itself as a set of instructions. Modern wayfinding experiments, including full open ocean voyages deliberately conducted without any modern instruments on board, have shown that trained navigators can track direction using the pattern of ocean swells felt through the hull of the boat, the position of specific stars rising and setting along a fixed section of the horizon, the flight paths of seabirds that reliably return to nearby land each evening, and even subtle shifts in water color and cloud formation that hint at reefs or islands still below the visible horizon. This is not guesswork dressed up as tradition. It is a complete, learnable sensory system, refined and passed down across generations, precise enough to locate a speck of land in an ocean covering roughly 60 million square miles. Your ancestors were not wandering aimlessly across the water hoping to get lucky. They were reading a world that most of us have completely lost the ability to see, let alone navigate by. Water was not the only obstacle. Deserts killed just as efficiently, and crossing them required a completely different kind of knowledge. Consider the journey across the Arabian Peninsula, a stretch of land that today looks almost entirely hostile to life. For a long time, researchers assumed early human populations simply avoided it, sticking to coastlines and river valleys where water was reliable. Then studies combining ancient climate data with archaeological finds scattered deep in the interior of the peninsula revealed something unexpected. During certain windows tied to shifts in monsoon patterns, the desert briefly transformed. Lakes formed where there is now only sand. Grasslands spread across areas that are bone-dry today. Ancient humans did not conquer the desert through sheer endurance. They waited for the desert to stop being a desert, then walked through the temporary window before it closed again. That single detail says something important about how migration actually worked. It was rarely a fight against the environment. It was closer to a negotiation with it, timed carefully around brief windows of opportunity that could open and close within a single lifetime. Mountains tell a similar story, just at higher altitude and lower oxygen. Populations that eventually settled on the Tibetan Plateau had to adapt to conditions that would leave most visitors gasping within minutes. Genetic studies on high-altitude populations have identified specific inherited traits linked to more efficient oxygen processing in the blood that appear to trace back to ancient interbreeding with a now-extinct human relative adapted to exactly that environment. In other words, some of the biological tools needed to survive at extreme altitude weren't invented from scratch. They were borrowed generations earlier from a different branch of the human family tree entirely. That's worth sitting with for a moment. The ability to breathe comfortably at an altitude that suffocates most people wasn't a decision anyone made. It was a genetic gift, passed down from an encounter so ancient that almost nothing else remains of it except that single, quietly life-saving trait. There's a pattern hiding underneath all of these separate stories. Every long-distance human migration, whether across a frozen land bridge, across a narrow ocean strait, or across the open Pacific, followed roughly the same basic sequence. Small movements came first. Local knowledge came second, built through repetition and shared within a community. Larger risks were only attempted once the smaller ones had already proven survivable, again and again, without disaster. Nobody sailed off the edge of the known world on day one, betting everything on a single roll of the dice. They built up to it, crossing by crossing, generation by generation, until distances that sound genuinely impossible today were, to them, simply familiar water they had traveled many times before. This matters because it quietly changes what exploration even means. You probably think of exploration as raw bravery, a single dramatic decision to go where absolutely no one has gone before, driven by boldness alone. But for most of human history, the truth was closer to the opposite of that image. It was caution repeated so many times in such small increments that it eventually looked like courage from the outside, even though it never felt that way from the inside. Why does any of this still matter to you, sitting wherever you happen to be sitting right now? Because that same instinct is still quietly running in your brain today. The pull to test something small before committing to something large. The comfort of a familiar route before you attempt a longer, riskier one. The way trust in any new path only builds after it has been walked, or sailed, or simply lived through enough times to start feeling safe. You didn't invent that caution yourself. You inherited it directly from people who used the exact same instinct to cross oceans they couldn't see across and land bridges that no longer exist. Every time you hesitate before a big decision and quietly take a smaller step first, testing the water before committing fully, you are running the same basic program that got a small group of humans across open water to Australia and later across the widest ocean on the planet, without a single instrument to guide them along the way. Consider how much of your own life still follows this exact structure without you noticing it. A new job feels less risky once you've had a smaller taste of the field first. A new city feels less foreign after a short visit before you commit to moving there. Even trusting a new person tends to build in stages, small test after small test, rather than arriving all at once. None of this is coincidence. It's inheritance. You check a map before a trip, and you trust it instantly because it was built by people who came before you, using instruments your ancestors never had. But your ancestors built their own maps too, out of stars, ocean swells, and the memory of which birds return home each evening. Different tools, built from whatever was available to them at the time. The exact same instinct underneath it all. They never stopped moving, testing small distances before trusting the large ones. And somehow, sitting right where you are now, neither have you.